What if I told you how you assess your students could make or break their learning experience? The two main forms of assessment we're going to talk about today is summative and formative, and why assessment matters. First off, as teachers, we need to know if our students are retaining, analyzing, and synthesizing the information that we're actually putting out to them. And I'm not a big believer in grades, but this is the primary method that we have for promoting students to the next level, is using grades. And we can only do that if we know that they have retained the skills and information necessary to move to that next level. Second of all, it helps the students. A lot of times when you're looking at a big concept, it may seem too big for the student to understand, but if you can break it into smaller chunks and they can be successful at those smaller pieces, eventually they'll understand that they can be successful at the entire skill or knowledge base. I'm John Van Dusen. I am a teacher, coach, and a soldier in the U.S. Army Reserve. I want to thank you for stopping by your classroom coffee break. So let's look at definitions here for a second. So a formative assessment is an ongoing process that monitors student learning and provides feedback for improvement. Now, this happens during the learning process while you are learning the skill or the knowledge base. And the primary purpose for this is to help guide instruction to make sure that what you're teaching is actually being received. So if you teach a lesson and then do a formative assessment and it appears that some of the students aren't picking up the concept or the knowledge base that you want, during a formative assessment, we can understand that quickly and adjust our lessons or our timeline to accommodate. Some examples of a formative assessment would be an exit ticket, a quiz, a think, pair, sure, simple observation, and anything else that happens during the lesson. One of my favorite ways to do formative assessment is to have students stand up out of their chairs, go meet with somebody from a different table, and talk about whatever the topic we're learning about is. And then I conduct an informal formative assessment by walking around and listening to what the different groups are talking to. A more formal way would be to do an exit ticket at the end, which is really easy if you use Kahoot or Google Forms. But the bottom line is you are doing this throughout the lesson so that you understand what your students are retaining and what they're ready for next. So the definition of a summative assessment is a final evaluation of student learning, typically at the end of the unit or a course. And the key purpose of this is to measure achievement and to see if students has met the objectives or met the state mandated standards that's required for their grade level. So a few examples of this would be a unit test or perhaps a unit project. Standardized tests fall into this category, as well as presentations. Personally, I'm not a big test guy. I only give a couple big tests throughout the year, but I do like projects, and I really like projects where students have to work with one other person so that they get that collaboration, but also where they have to illustrate a concept. I was taught very early in my teaching career that if a student can illustrate a concept, they more than likely understand it. So let's talk about 4 key differences between summative and formative assessment. First of all, timing. With formative assessment, that happens during the learning while the lesson is taking place. And just because it's happening during the lesson doesn't mean it doesn't take several days, depending on the concept or the knowledge base that you're learning about. Summative assessment happens after the learning takes place and basically summarizes everything that students should have learned in accordance with the standards and objectives. Another key difference between summative and formative assessment is the feedback. During formative assessment, it provides immediate feedback to adjust teaching and learning. Again, that's where you take a snapshot of where your students are so that you know what they can handle next, or if there's something that you need to review. Summative feedback occurs after completion of the lesson and is often there for accountability and grades to let you know and the student know if they have met the learning goal and are ready to proceed to the next concept or knowledge base. The difference in purpose between the summative and formative assessment. Formative assessment is meant to be improvement focused. Again, you do that assessment during the learning so that you can improve your lesson to make sure students are understanding the concepts. Where summative assessment is judgment focused. You're actually judging to see if that student has retained, analyzed, and synthesized those concepts and information to a point where they can use them in the future. And the last difference we'll talk about between formative and summative assessment is frequency. Formative assessment is something that you do a lot. You do it several times throughout the lesson, but it's low stakes. Some of the times it's not even graded. Maybe even most of the time it's not graded, again, because it's being used to improve your teaching. Summative assessment is infrequent and very high stakes. So that's your state mandated test. That's your unit test. You'll only do a few throughout the year. better. And again, it's higher stakes because those are typically things that are used to assess a student's growth against the learning goals, state mandated standards, and objectives. So some digital tools that can help you with your summative and formative assessment include, but are not limited to, Kahoot, EdPuzzle, and Google Forms are fantastic for that formative assessment, completing those assessments during the lesson. And then for summative assessments, I personally like Summative, which is a really great way to have an online testing platform. But you can also use paper and pencil tests. You can use Google Classroom. There's a ton of different ways that you can do summative and formative assessment digitally. And I'm always trying to improve my teaching. So if you have a great way to do formative or summative assessment in your classroom, please share it in the comments below. Or find me on X at Classroom Coffee Break and keep this conversation going. Now, let's talk about a couple of challenges you could have with different types of assessments. First off, formative assessment does take a little extra time, and it's super easy to just push it by the wayside and stick strictly to your summative assessment. But I'm going to caution you against doing that, because if you get to the end of the unit and do the summative assessment and realize there's something that the students didn't get somewhere in the middle, you may have to back up further than you would if you're doing those formative assessments, those Kahoots, those flashcards, those exit tickets, to the point where you could stop right when students are struggling, help them get over that hump, and then proceed with the rest of the unit. Another challenge you might have coming from the students is they see it as extra work, where they have to do an extra exit ticket or an extra Google form. And especially if it's not graded, they may just blow it off. So an easy way to fix that is to use some form of game like Kahoot or Blookit, or to just make it a part of the standard lesson where they have to complete the formative assessment while you're going through the lesson, and it just appears like it's normal classwork, not anything out of the ordinary. And I'll just leave you with this. Please remember that assessment is not just for you to put it in the gradebook, but it's also for the student to help them, quote unquote, eat the elephant. If they see a task that seems too big at the beginning, if you can break it up into those formative assessments and they can be successful in a step-by-step manner, by the time you get to that unit test or that summative assessment, they'll be knocking it out of the park. If you got some value out of this episode, please subscribe, like, and share so others can stop by for their classroom coffee break.